Welcome, everybody. Hopefully, you're able to peel away this morning. Some of us have had some difficulty with that. To talk all things peak prep. I mean, and this is the challenge of prepping for peak, is that you are in the midst of all of the disruption that is sort of ever present and always something new, something different. We've got a lot of that to talk about today. But yeah, welcome. I'll pass it around to Matt and John to do introductions, but I'm Jessica Wyndham, Solving Work, Principal Consultant and Founder. We work on establishing people, processes, and partners that allow you to have the bandwidth to survive the disruption. So, Matthew?
Me, I'm Matthew Zarzycki from Monarch Connect, the logistics ambassador. Finally have this is a couple of months now, with the company, my own co-founder, all the fun stuff, all 3PL stuff, all the great things that are going on. Feeling that stress of peak season, not going to lie. There's a lot of going on. I can't wait to talk about it because I'm all over the place. So my franticness is probably going to show today. So I'll give it to John to kind of do a more calming, relaxing kind of introduction.
Well, I'm glad you led with that. I was like, man, you guys are way too high energy for me right now. I'm like a slow morning. So I'm John, principal, and I will also agree with consultant because it makes it easier for everyone to understand operational innovations, which is a focus to get more value out of your operations, whether you're on the retail side, brand side, or a service provider, really optimizing your revenue, sort of streamlining your costs and building out new capabilities. So work with everyone from startups to some pretty large multinational retailers.
Awesome. And I know we want to talk peak season, but before we jump into that, before we jump into anything, please drop your comments into the chat. We'll see them, we'll address them. Questions you might have on peak season, questions or comments you have on what we're talking about, an avenue we should explore. Please, let's make this as interactive as possible. But before we jump into anything, let's talk about our current disruption, the Canada Rail strike. What do you guys think? How long is it going to last? Use your crystal ball. And what are the long-term impacts on peak season, if anything? Do you guys have any comments?
Oh, plenty and too many. I predicted it incorrectly. I thought for sure they're going to, be negotiating right to the last hour. I thought the government would come in. I thought they would figure it out before it got to this stage because I don't think the supply chain can handle or should handle any disruptions, especially after the Canadian government posted, hey, how great we are doing with our inflation numbers are finally coming down. And then we're going to get this giant, huge grinding halt of a supply chain in Canada. For those who don't know, it's about $1 billion a day that they're kind of moving of freight.
Which is like all of our money. No, I'm joking.
All of it.
Well, and to remember that a lot of the activity does go cross border. So this isn't just this is a North America issue, yep. not a Canada issue for sure.
Well, so one thing that I thought was interesting is that, and I don't know if Matt, you saw this, just maybe it came up in the US, but what they're saying now too is that the port in British Columbia, which is our like West Coast, kind of like, the port of LA, like BC is where we get a lot of our Asian volume imports and things like that. What they're saying now is that they're waiting to go on strike and they're tying it in with the rail. And now what they're saying too is that there's some real concerns even coming out of the US that if shipments that are meant to be inbound to the port in Vancouver get diverted into the US, they may be like, nah, we're standing tall with like sort of our brothers from the north, and we're not going to unload these shipments. So there could be all kinds of really crazy bumps that people are not really expecting and 100% did not plan for.
Yeah, and it's perfect, not perfect. I mean, it's horrible timing for peak season because everybody's prepping, and now we're going to have a lot of backlog. What we don't understand is a lot of this stuff has consequences into the peak season. Right now, we have this massive feel that everybody feel, but I don't know if everybody.
Oh my God! Come on! It's like any contract. It's like when you're going to negotiate when you're in the most advantageous position. So if you know that you're about to see a surge in activity in the most important part of the year, you probably have the most leverage to negotiate and to take action now than if it was like February.
No, I agree. I meant from our like the logistics providers perspectives, the shippers and the receivers, the people who are actually shipping. You're right from the rail perspective, 100%. It is the most advantageous thing, and this is also on the heels of other international events that are happening. I don't know if you guys
Mhm.
saw in China there was a giant port that got exploded a week ago, which they said there's going to have a whole bunch of issues as well. Find different ways out of China. This is all creating a cascading effect, including what we're seeing right now, right?
Well, the other
Well,
thing
and
too, sorry, the East Coast U.S. ports are, I mean, they've sort of kicked the can down the road to February, but I think that there's a chance of slowdowns and work stoppages between now and then. Not that February is safe because Chinese New Year comes into play at that time, so they won't have lost all their leverage, but they could use now to put the crunch to make progress in those negotiations.
Yep.
As well. So we could have just all of North America grind to a halt. And then the other thing I thought, and then sorry, I'll let you go, John, is everyone using the de minimis and shipping into Canada. I know that's more popular into Mexico, but there are folks that ship into Canada and then do the e-commerce direct
Mhm.
to take advantage of the 301. So there is a lot at play here.
Well, and the last one, just to give everyone a good scare, so that they think nothing is safe, is that on the flip side, now your air capacity is going to just dry up and shoot up like crazy too, right? Trucking is going to go up, but air movements, right, especially what we've been seeing out of Asia recently, um, like, well, if I can't ship my container, if I'm going to have this, I have that, I'm going to have to get some product in, I'm going to book air. But air is the most restricted type of capacity. There's just not as much, right? Like, and
Yeah.
there's been a lot of shifts there. It's kind of interesting. FedEx had been making a big play to do more air movements from, sort of Asian countries, especially with some of the changes with the USPS. So it'll be curious to see how everything plays out. But I think probably the most bottom line thing is that the likelihood that your budget for Q4 is no longer valid.
Yeah, and start having those conversations now. But even on the air freight, so we move past the headlines so fast because there's always another one. But I think it's like 70% of air volume does fly in the belly of commercial aircraft, and we are only 2 weeks out from the crowd strike that grounded like all of North American flights for an entire day, which saw a surge. So we could just be recovering from that, and now we enter this, and it's not just going to be a result of whether or not we can move these containers around. Those containers are not going to be unloaded and sent back to Asia to then be able to be loaded again. So that's going to put further pressure on the air market. So this does have a big effect.
Exactly. Most people don't actually realize that those containers are usually, most of the time they're owned by the ocean vessel companies or whatever, or different type of parties. But you're right that they're a system. They're meant to be delivered and be brought back, and there's actually some pretty serious penalties and fines if you're not getting them back in time, specifically for what you're saying about them having to go back, sort of be the next batch of orders, so to speak, or two batches out. But yeah, it definitely has some longer term implications.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so that's going to affect things. And then on the heels of that, in terms of talking about what's different this peak season, is that we have a shorter number of days between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So everybody wants inventory earlier, Amazon. So all of that's going to get wrapped up into this. Are there any other sort of differences this peak season? Budget's blown. So this is a conversation we should start having now and not in January, if you want to get ahead of that. But beyond that, what's going to be different?
I mean, I think a lot of things are going to be different because I think it's a feeding frenzy out there, first of all, as well. People have smelt a little bit of quote unquote blood in the water, and they're just going and grabbing whatever we can. And to put it in perspective, right now, from Toronto to BC was a regular lane that would probably pay around 7,000 Canadian, 6,000 Canadian on a regular. Now it's gone through the roof, and probably on certain people I heard are paying double, triple that to get their product moving. And a lot of the shippers are going to be rethinking, like, do I recoup the cost like we did after COVID? Do I look for sustainability, for stability for next little bit? Are these kind of interruptions going to be more common than they were? Because if it looks like they're becoming more and more common, something is always happening, and everybody's just trying to jump on a proper rate. So is there something that we could do in the system where we can equalize that instability and try to get it? I don't know, but it's definitely going to be an interesting peak. I thought for sure it'd be next quarter, Q1, Q2, when we start normalizing, but this is definitely going to be a little bit of a hyper push to get things to start moving in a different direction. I'm curious to see how that's going to affect the gig workers in the final mile, because that usually doesn't get affected because the middle mile, first mile hits it first. How they're going to see that influx in a few weeks and how they're going to kind of respond after, especially after all this kind of gets subsides. Are they going to start going, hey, we can't take on all this freight, or we need adjusted rates? That's more of a pondering question for John and you, Jess, than myself.
I think first, I think to come back to kind of Jess's initial ask, what do you think about this season? I think that there's a lot. I think actually it's probably going to be a very tough year economically, right? Like I pay a lot of attention to Chinese e-commerce just because of the fact so much is coming out of there, and so much of people's experiences around the Asian markets. China's retail sales are not doing very well. There's a big movement from a lot of their platforms to try to sell on more value, to bring up prices, because they're all really seeing that these like low cost goods that have been fueling purchases aren't connecting as well anymore as people are shifting their preferences. And on top of it, people are just not spending over there. And I think we're going to see something very similar. You're going to see people that are a lot tighter with their dollar. They're going to expect better deals, which is really a bad situation for merchants or any type of vendor. Is like, your rates are going to go up. Consumer expectations are that they want to pay less, or that you're going to have to discount or entice them even more with the offer. So I think that that's going to make for a really hard peak season. And I fully expect like the likes of Amazon and Walmart and these guys to just take advantage. Like they have the treasure trove of cash to burn, and they're going to take advantage of it, which is going to put more pressure on smaller vendors or, more niche retailers or segmented retailers. And I think it's going to hurt. I think it's going to hurt a lot of people this year, especially just when you're talking about tighter window, more money for everybody in a shorter period of time, less time to earn, so to speak, more, paychecks coming in. I don't think it's the best combination of things in 2024 for anyone. Well, other than maybe some service providers, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
True.
the boom and bust with the ocean carriers and the truckload market, like I feel a little bit more for the truckload market because it has been in the hole for so long, but people are going to be looking to get paid. And the same thing on the, on the side of the ocean carriers, they're going to want their containers back, and that's going to hurt, but it's going to drive prices up everywhere. So, they're going to have the chance to get out of the hole. But I do remember back to COVID, and I don't think we're in a COVID level disruption, though if this extends a significant period of time, maybe that would change. But, we had a lot of businesses go bankrupt in the follow-on years because their inventory costs were so high, and the spending was so low, and the discounting had to be so much that they hit a threshold where they had to restructure. I know that happened to Instapot, and it happened to several other big name brands. So I think it's something to really think about and consider. And then against the economy as a whole, which, that is, I can't ride the wave. I just can't do it. Every day it's something else. Oh, the market's up. Oh, the market's down. Oh, that's just a dress rehearsal for what's coming. But whatever, if we see a significant increase in inflation and the interest rates don't drop, like that will affect the stock market, which then will affect some of the decisions businesses are making, which then trickle down. Although I try not to live in the in the moment because it's so insane.
Yeah.
But this will have a big impact, and this peak season will reverberate throughout probably the first 6 months of next year.
So who do you think, Jess, is the most vulnerable in that case scenario from your perspective? Like which mode or which final mile? Who do you think is most exposed right now because of all these disruptions?
I mean, I don't think it's the carriers that are the providers that are not the exposed people. Maybe from a provider standpoint, the 3PLs, because they're gonna have to deal with, like, all of the forecasts that maybe we provided them are all going to get blown out the window because everyone's going to be trying to do whatever they can to get the goods in the most cost effective manner, but it's gonna whip for them. But I think it's shippers, it's brands that are going to have the biggest impact here, which is really tough because they're the ones that don't have a say in what's happening. They don't have a seat at this table, aside from pressuring maybe the government to make moves. So I think the people that are going to get hurt the worst are the brands.
Yeah, I mean the brands are definitely going to get blown out from where they expected to be. But Matt, to your point, from a service provider side, 100% final mile carriers, last mile carriers, and warehouse providers are gonna really have to deal with a lot of pressure, right? Because last mile, especially, I know, and look, you know how much I talk about it, and I love these guys, but the reality is this: almost everybody, what if you go on their website, just pick anyone, and anyone watching right now, pick any regional carrier and that's doing just last mile or whatever. I guarantee you it takes you about 6 seconds before you find the term low cost or something like that on their website, on the homepage. That's what they sell on. Unfortunately, most last mile providers believe that the only real value they can provide is low cost. Because I'll tell you straight up, things like email communication and pictures and actually getting it done, like that's just normal, guys. Like that's not extra stuff. So I think a lot of brands are going to go back to them and expect, hey, you need to help us out. We're hurting. Like we have to get our product here because if we can't sell, you won't deliver anyway. And same for the warehouses, right? If product isn't getting into the country, if it's not making it into the fulfillment networks, no sales are going to happen. So,
Yeah.
The people from the truckload side will get theirs. The ocean carriers will get theirs. The air freight will get theirs. But 100% the warehousing partners and the last mile carriers, who both unfortunately pitch very often on low cost, are going to, I think they're going to be pinned the hardest from the retailers because the other people have enough choice that they don't need to. Ocean carrier be like, look, if it's not you, it's the next guy. So I'm going to get my rate. You know what I mean? So.
Well, it's also the modes that have the most active spot market versus the ones that don't, like small parcel last mile, that's usually on a contracted rate. Now FedEx and UPS are really good with their demand surcharges, and those are probably going to be a bigger factor this year than they've ever been before. So obviously we have our peak season all the time surcharges, but the week specific based on volume above normal with this compressed timeline is probably going to come into play more than it ever has in the past. And what's difficult about that is you're not going to be able to, well, I don't know. Maybe, John, this is a good question for you. Can I rate shop with that in mind? Because if I have a low cost rate, but I blow it out the water with my demand surcharge, which I won't know until after I've shipped, is there a way to protect against that? Because I think these are going to come into play big time this year.
Well, the demand surcharges are usually, for the most part, like geographically or package based. So, and you should know. If somehow you don't know before you hit print, that's probably a problem in your system. But
there's the ones that are like, hey, if you ship in this week 125%, 150%, 200% over your average. So it's like, it's based on the volume with which you put through the system. So I think those are just things to keep an eye on.
I think it keeps, like definitely, for example, where it could get hurt is if like your providers or your network starts moving slower than you would have liked and volume spills into a period where you wouldn't really have wanted it to ship, that for sure becomes problematic. And then, with the other interesting thing is, and we can maybe start opening up like peak prep things people should be doing. You're going to get a lot of chatter right now from every regional player, every small player talking about, we don't do demand surcharges, we don't do this, whatever. And honestly, a lot of them don't, and that's really good. But, from a brand side, whether you're a retailer, with a broader brick and mortar infrastructure, or you're a DTC kind of operator and you're e-commerce only, I would really caution to be careful with that. Like, everybody has a capacity, okay? No matter if they say that they have gig workers or whatever, that guy working for Roadie, that guy working for Viho, the person working for whoever, like there's always a capacity because everybody can only do so much in a given period of time. And then especially with gig work vehicles, one of the biggest challenges is that nobody does proper capacitization. Like, they don't actually know how much cubic feet that the person coming in can get. They go like, oh, well, you have to hold up to 40, or this order size is between 20 and 40 cubic feet, but they don't actually know what the person has. So that's a big advantage that people like Amazon have, their DSPs, other really great providers like Front Door Collective, for example, that are much more structured and really have a strong understanding of what they can do. They do things differently. So I think you have to be very careful about someone saying that they have access to just millions of people and it's unlimited demand, because some platforms say that. I think you have to be very careful with that when you're planning, because everybody's going to have a limit, and when that much volume starts pouring out of the system, it's going to slow people down, like, for sure.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, I guess that's the question I have. Is it too late to onboard a new carrier? Like, do you think there's enough time, just barely? And then obviously in context of, capacity will become an issue, and the forecasts that, if they're being provided, are probably not going to be very accurate this year. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think you can still onboard new carriers. I mean, a lot of them will work through platforms. Like if you use something like OneRail, for example, you don't actually know half the time, like, where specifically it's going. It goes through them, and then they sort of redistribute it out through networks. So you can definitely still use platforms. You probably would still have an opportunity for the next, I don't know, let's call it, like, I think you probably always find someone that's willing to onboard. I think what ends up becoming, though, is the conversation shifts, right? Like the later you go, probably the less favorable your position is going to be. So you might be able to onboard a new carrier, may not be with the SLAs that you expect. It may not be with the rates that you expect. I think for the most part, you can always find someone that's willing to do it. I think that can you find enough people that are willing to do it in a way that works for your budget, that works for your type of product, and works with your brand promise. I think that's probably what that becomes a little bit more challenging the longer you go.
Well, and let's talk about that. Let's talk about folks that are in the midst of that, because we sort of talked about this before we went live, which is Pitney Bowes. Like, that was our major headline, I think, from last week. It feels like we're already over it and moved on to the next thing. But there hasn't been as much talk about fallout from that. I'm sure there's some people that are in a lot of pain. But in general, that seems to have been pretty non-issue-y. And, John, you were saying it's because maybe people were accessing them through a platform. Those folks are in the market, they're onboarding and things like that. But what do you think? Is there any disruption in the market from that, or are we pretty much business as usual?
I haven't really seen too much. I think a lot of the people that were, really big, important clients, typically whenever those types of things happen, they're given a little bit more notice that they might need to start looking for alternatives, or that there would be a shift. Like if you're some of the real majors, and the reality is, for the volume that Pitney was shipping, like, quarter of a million packages a year or whatever, they had big accounts, like, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. There were some big accounts that they had, and I'm sure that they were given the right kind of notice. There also hasn't been any shortage of people offering. And, look, let's be real. If you have significant volume, you're attractive to everyone. So you would get immediate feedback. You'd get immediate consideration. I do think, though, that some of the aggregators are getting a lot of volume just through rate shopping and platforms. Yeah. So, I'm sure other people that were doing similar work have seen a boost in their activity, because the reality is, anyone that essentially is consolidating and pushing into USPS like Pitney was doing, you're just adding more volume. You're not actually changing the activity, and that becomes a little bit easier, especially with DeJoy's expectation of pushing things further out, which means there's fewer DBUs to inject into, and you have to bring it to fewer facilities. So I think some people have definitely seen their volume go up. And I suspect the bigger ones had known for some time that they were going to have to make a switch.
Well, go ahead, Matthew.
I was going to say, I think it's interesting to also take, and we talked about it too, John, you and I, about how many other companies are on this moment of teetering that they could be the next Pitney Bowes that are actually offering something, or they're aggregators, because they've been pushing this agenda of, hey, we have capacity, we need more volume. They have a whole bunch of volume, but still not enough to generate that profit margin. They're generating great revenue, but they haven't reached that critical mass yet. And now they're going to start peeling back and going, I don't have enough. Even with the Pitney Bowes guys gone, but there's a lot of activity in the marketplace that there's still a lot of changes happening. I don't know. I'm not convinced that we still haven't seen another big guy kind of taking a faltering step, or like UPS got rid of Coyote, start shedding some of this dead weight. I know Transforce out of Canada, which is a big name in the US too, has talked about we're going to get rid of all the non-profitable segment of our businesses and accounts, because we're tired of the rat race, and let someone else deal with it. We're just going to focus on profitable accounts.
Well, yeah, and it's so funny too, because I see a lot, I think we all do, but I see a lot of chatter on there about diversification and this and that, and it kind of, I'm always curious. I support diversification, but I also think that it needs to be managed in an appropriate way. Like I was on the other side of the table where you're like, let's call it like that vendor, that shipper side. I'm gonna make it really easy. That shipper side. And the reality is that like you don't want to have all of these different people where you're just pushing volume wherever and you're losing control. The reality is you're trying to find the right balance of how do I mitigate enough risk while also being important, while also, getting the right kind of costing and stuff like that. Like I still remember, as an example, we had an issue when I was back in one of my previous roles, and there was a labor disruption. And one of the biggest issues was a real tightening in terms of capacity in one part of the country. And the carrier just straight up was like, listen, like we've made the strategic decision to make sure that we take care of all of our customers. And Matt, I think we talked about this in a similar context the other day. To take care of our customers, we're going to keep doing the volume. Like, yeah, there's going to be some bumps in pricing a little bit, but like we're going to really make sure that your activity keeps going. And that was just because the reality is we were important enough. Like we were too important to a certain degree to just like slough off and be like, oh, forget about it. And I think that that's where there's a lot of bad advice, to be quite honest with you, that comes out of LinkedIn and different places, especially where people are like putting up 1,000 logos and being like, diversify. It's like, okay, be nobody to everybody, essentially. And, don't be able to do anything really strategic or whatever. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges that e-commerce brands especially get into when they're using a platform to do whatever you're doing, is that you're nobody. You're using the platform's account. You're merging your volume with everybody else. Nobody really knows who you are.
Yeah.
So even if you've got really great volume, all they see is your platform's account, and they think they're the important customer, and they'll continue to manage that customer on a really aggregated level, but not necessarily your business. So I think, you want to find the right level of where do I pick my partners? Where is it strategic to do so? And I would often recommend find your really strong partners in your markets of strength where you're doing really well. You want to rate shop for the stuff that's like the bottom 20% of your business, 30, 40, whatever it could be. But most certainly don't just diversify and rate shop all of your business. Like you're just exposing yourself to mad risk.
I mean, I think this is the same kind of conversation when we talk about, distributed inventory. Oh, look what Target's doing. Oh, look what Amazon's doing. Like, okay, that's really interesting when you have buku volume. Mm-hmm. When you are a smaller shipper, you need to execute these strategies with your volume in mind. Like you can't do what Amazon can do. You don't have the economies of scale. You don't have the volume to make some of these strategies work. So you really have to think about what makes sense in terms of your volume. And the thing we talk about all the time is that logistics, transportation, freight, distribution, all of this is a relationship business. And if you are outsourcing all of your stuff to a 3PL, you lose some of that relationship. Now, if you have a great relationship with the 3PL, that's another.
I was gonna say, keep manage, the relationships with the 3PL. Don't cut out the 3PL.
but you have to do it intelligently,
yep.
Right? Like, and there is a volume where going direct starts to make sense, and there is a volume where leveraging an intermediary makes sense, and you have to figure that out.
Everything has to be a little bit of a balance. Even, on a topic that I was chatting about with somebody recently is even the retail private fleets. There's some of, they have an advantage of having running their own goods, but they're running at an advantage because they don't pay the same fines. They don't pay the same they're not held to the same standard as a 3PL. if we keep everybody to the kind of same standard and we kind of mix and match everything through, the whole supply chain will always be better. You can't go 100% your own fleet because then you overexpose yourself. You're going to have a lot of dead costs that you're running back and forth. That's part of the reason why Walmart doesn't do everything on their own fleet, even though they're the largest fleet in the USA.
Except Walmart will do everything that's like super profitable for them, and they'll make sure to give the stuff that's not so profitable away.
I'm not going to specifically name any customers.
I know. I think, yeah.
You can, John. I love Walmart.
No, honestly, Walmart does it smart. Look, the reality is everybody's going to try to take advantage, and I think that's probably more the message. Take advantage where you can, spin your flywheel, and then give the opportunity to other people. Because if, to your point, while a particular activity may not be in Walmart's own sort of wheelhouse to get the most out of it, when it's them and 3 or 4 other people that then consolidate or work with similar partners, all of a sudden those more challenging lanes can become just as strong, but because they're not managing it or they're not doing it themselves or all themselves.
Well, it's going to be an interesting landscape because you and I argued about this now, and I want to say argue because it was an argument. Passionately
debated.
We were furious about it, but I want Jess to kind of weigh in on that conversation because we were talking about new last mile, new logistics providers kind of coming in, and John's point is 90% of all the courier businesses run by 4 companies, right? He said the USPS, the FedEx, the UPS, and the Amazon. And I said that there's always going to be like new disruptors that are kind of coming in. Like I mentioned, Walmart. He goes, it's still the same kind of activity. It's still these guys managing their own freight, and you're just kind of adding on to it. Do you see just another player that's coming in that's more of a true 3PL-ish kind of type, not a 3PL, maybe a provider of that sense that's going to join that massive influx and maybe take on that night? Because there's a big piece of the pie to take on. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, right?
I mean, I think OnTrack wants to, like they're all on the West Coast, all on the East Coast. They're bridging it with Chicago. They're adding new lanes. I think that's what they want. I don't know if it makes sense for them to do some more acquisition, like to get like LSO or whatever and be that true end to end. But I think you have to have the end to end in order to do it. And I don't think that the gig players are going to be able to be one of the top 5. I don't think that they need to have that goal either. I think they can be successful and not be in the top 5. But I would say not on the horizon. And we should all be freaking grateful because for the longest time, it was just UPS and FedEx. And there was no, I guess USPS was always there, but there really was no Amazon. There was no alternative. And now Amazon's coming in with their direct like common carrier program. It's out there, it's working. We're going to test it this first peak season and see if they can meet their promise. But if they do well this peak season, I think that's a major disruption to what has been the duopoly for over 20 years.
Yeah, except and this is where my position came from. Is not like I think that there's opportunity in last mile to do things differently. To your point, though, the biggest challenge is Amazon is there now, and they're being very disruptive. And it only took 20 years and billions of dollars. And the challenge with any new regional coming in, and this is where I try to encourage both service providers and brands to start thinking about the promise and the experience more than transactional volume. Like if I'm a startup, let's say, or a small company, and I need funding, how interesting am I to a VC or to some PE firms or anything where it's like, so what are you guys going to do? We're going to come in and we're going to be an alternative carrier that's ultra low cost, and we're just going to outperform all of the other guys that have hundreds of billions of dollars invested, but we're going to start from scratch. Like, does that sound like something you want to, I can't wait, take my money? Like, absolutely not. It's like,
not with these interest rates.
No one's coming in to be an ultra commodity. So that's why I think if you want to be a regional player, I think that's where last mile, delivery, customer experience all has to be thought of differently, because instead of thinking like, oh, there's a duopoly or there's a trifecta of whatever of these big players or a quartet, I think, wow, I got those all right on the first shot. Anyways, like, there's like all of these, different players. Like instead of thinking about, hey, I'm going to challenge these guys for their transactional brown box volume, it's like, why? Like why race to the bottom on commodities as opposed to being like, what can I create that's new, novel, and really innovative? Like truly different in terms of connecting with the customer and shifting from transactional to more like experiential or flexible or some other way of connecting with customers. For example, like this thing I have coming out tomorrow about Sephora. One thing that I thought was interesting that nobody mentioned was that they're a retailer and they're like, yeah, because we support on demand because we want that person at the hotel who forgot something to be able to have something for their night out. And that's a very different customer perspective when you're talking about delivery and a reason to have ultra fast or whatever, not just because of they think that they can like, oh, we gotta try to just appeal to everybody.
Value.
They have a real reason for that value, and that will connect.
Yeah, that's a great example. But how many out there? Why do you have to be so different though? Why can't you just do the one thing fantastically? Why can't you just be the best in a traditional model? And I think everybody always tries to have this specific niche, and we've talked about this too. I think all of us about being the best final mile in a regional area. You don't have to go, and you mentioned this earlier in the conversation, you don't have to go national. Why not be the best in the New York State, or why not be the best in the Tri-City area, or down along to California, and just be the most profitable in doing that function and having that stability and grow that? Because there's enough activity to be that regional player. But I think everybody has this mentality that I have to be a national brand.
And I think there's something to that, especially now that we have some connectors out there who are like pooling volume and moving things regionally, and I think that model works really well in that context where somebody is leveraging, commercial air, belly freight space or whatever, and moving these packages into the market, because you still want those packages that originate in LA. Like, if we were more collaborative, and then maybe that's something that could be truly transformational, and then we were able to leverage the best in the best of in the regional areas, like, hey, you got something of value there.
So let's take the last 20 minutes or so that we have. Let's try to give people something very specific.
Talk about Peak.
Well, very specific on like, what would you do or what do you recommend? Like you're sitting in front of a client, operations, logistics space, right? Whether they're retail stores, whether they're service providers, whatever. What are the types of things that, Jess, Matt, like you guys would say, okay, guys, here are like the best practices for, managing a peak season?
Yeah, I'll start with that. Look, I think you got to get your own house in order. I'm always talking about building bandwidth to withstand disruption. That means, what do you do on the day-to-day? What balls are you dropping? You drop balls today, peak season is going to bring even more challenge. So let's set something down. You need to make an intentional decision about what you are and are not going to do during peak season. This is a business decision that we'll make. We'll not just let it hit the fan. Make a business decision, communicate that out, take something off your people's plate so that they have the bandwidth to deal with the additional volume, the disruption that brings, and they can creatively problem solve. Like, don't burn yourself and your people out as you are endeavoring to do this. And that looks at your processes and your technology and fix the teeny tiny crap that creates all of these small annoyances that just piss everybody off. It's too late to do the big stuff. I mean, maybe you could do one big thing, but it's too late for the big stuff. The big stuff is a February conversation. It's not a September conversation. So now look at the teeny tiny problems that you put off forever and solve those. Take that irritation out of the system so people have the bandwidth to do the job of peak season. That is my soapbox.
It's a little bit tougher for me because my peak season obviously looks a little bit different from a final mile perspective. It functions a little bit different, and there's different avenues for it. Like peak's happening right now for produce, so it's really going hard right now. What you can do for prepping for it, it's challenging to do because it's hard to forecast on something like the Canadian rail strike. So I always use the 70-30 rule. Have 70% of your freight with proper service providers, have it contracted in, and talk to your customers and have that kind of your own volume in that 70-30, and have 30 to be able to adjust for that peak. Don't burn your bridge when a disruption does happen. Don't all of a sudden go to your customer and be like, I need to jack my rates. Try to keep that. Be like, hey, I've committed to you for 5 loads a week. I can definitely do those 5 loads a week that we've committed to. But if you need that 6th and that 7th, I am going to need additional surge capacity, and have that within your contract and your negotiations all year long. Because when it comes to a moment like this and you all of a sudden are bringing this up, it's going to have a bad taste in your customer's mouth. But if you have that conversation early on, be like, hey, I'm committed to you. I commit to X amount of volume. No problem. I will keep my rate. But anything above it, I am going to have to surge, and the price is going to be based off what's happening in the marketplace. That's where the customer is going to realize, and it's, have that conversation. Now, when it's calm, when you're having a conversation with a customer, when they're pulling their hair out because they're trying to find trucks, and then all of a sudden you go, hey, I need 25 grand to go to Vancouver from Toronto. You could be like, what the hell? We had an agreement for 6,000. Like, you just lost that customer. That's the bad way of going about it, in my opinion. So having these kind of ideas ahead of time, I know it's hard to kind of guess. You just want to get that freight, but putting it in there, be like, hey, I'm committed to you to work with you, but these are the things I need to have in place, not just a force majeure, but things that happen outside of our circumstances. Let us be able to kind of adjust and be able to still service you the way we have been servicing you, would be my suggestion and my call out. How does that look for you, John? Does that answer what you were kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what do people need to consider? Like, there's a few things when I was on, whichever side you want to think of it on, right? I think something that most people don't do, and I always recommend, and I used to do this with my teams, is have like a plan and your contingencies. So many people get into situations where things pop up and they start, peaking and just bubbling up, and they're trying to make decisions very quickly now, in a reactive mode. One thing that was always really beneficial for myself and the teams was saying, okay, we know we typically have these types of challenges. What are the decisions that we want to decide now that we're going to make in that moment? So it's kind of like, how like they're like, oh, Obama had like 2 colors of suit, so it was either like A or B, and just never having to think about it. It's like, have some of those really stressful decisions already done, because you're not going to have time to be arguing, between different departments, arguing with your partners or whatever. Have some of those and communicate those in advance. I think that that's a really important thing to have. If you're a service provider, most in their contracts have a flex anywhere 10, 15, maybe 20% flex from baseline, and then they get into like what they can cover for peak. But I still think that discussion between a shipper or a vendor, merchant, whatever, and their service provider in terms of like real capacity, like what does that really mean for me? And like, when do you actually hit a wall? And if your provider can't give you those numbers or can't tell you, hey, here's what we can actually do, and anything beyond this limit, like we're going to have to hold or we're going to do this, I think are conversations that need to happen, because all too often people kind of just keep like rolling the dice and they hope that they're going to get through every day. And then what makes it even worse is when some days there was no real plan and they shouldn't have actually gotten through the day, but they somehow miraculously did. And they're like, oh, see, we can do it. But it's like, no, guys, like even a broken watch is right twice a day. Like sometimes luck just happens that way.
Yeah.
So I think, really understanding those things. And then I think honestly, from a brand perspective, is how do you actually focus on making sure that your best stuff is going to have the highest opportunity to push through. So I would make trade-offs and concessions of being like, I need you to prioritize this, and we'll deprioritize that. I want these types of things really watched. These ones I can live with shortages or whatever. I mean, everybody wants every sale all the time, but sooner or later decisions get made. So I think having a lot of those things in place first, and understanding the fact that your promises are going to change. If someone's telling you that they're going to do, double or triple your volume and nothing is going to change, that's highly unlikely. So don't bank on that.
So I got a question for you, because that spurs an idea in my mind. That works great. I think those points make great sense if you're a bigger entity. a lot of these guys that are the smaller entry level SMEs, they might not have the experience, they might not have the know-how, they might be weary that they might scare the customer away or whatnot. So they'll over promise on a lot of these things, or they may not even know that this might happen. You know what I mean? How do you suggest for these fourth quarters of these companies that are gaining traction, they're getting into that bigger stage? What should they look out for to understand it within their own system, not out to their customer? How should they evaluate their own abilities and to be able to do it? Because you don't know on a day-to-day basis which customers are going to flex. Let's say you have 15 customers. You never suspect all 15 are all of a sudden going to surge. So how do you prioritize certain customers? Do you prioritize certain lanes? How do you go about that as a service provider and go, hey, this is what I'm able to do during peak? I was never even thinking about this possibility, but should I be thinking about it, or should I just be living in the reactionary world of one truck, one load, one gig work, one delivery?
Personally, I'm much more of the fan that I really do think that you need to analyze your volume and your business and your customers and be truthful about who means what to where. Like the reality is, if one customer is 40% of your business and the next closest customer is 19% of your business, like that they're going to be like more impactful to you. That whatever happens with them is going to have a bigger influence on what starts happening. So I would always encourage people to talk with your brands, right? And while peak and the holiday season is different, it is also promotions on steroids. You get more promotions, but still similar very often because people do things that they know works for their brand and connects with their customers. So more promotions from more customers in a shorter period of time. So you can look at like the seasonality, and I don't use that in the sense of weather. I use it in the sense of activity, and say, okay, well, over the last, and depending on how long you've had it, the longer you've had a customer, the better for data. But what did they do over the last year with every time their promotions? What's a typical promotional surge? If I had them last year, how much was that different from the baseline, and how much different was that from promotional peaks, for example, and really understand what it is. Once you kind of have that data framework and understanding broadly like a picture and you have some context, then I think that's where the best companies, both that have real partnerships with their brands, will speak and say, okay, last year you kind of did this, or last year we saw this. What are you planning to do this year? I know you can't tell me specifically all of your promotions or whatever, but are you anticipating doing something different? Are you going to try a new twist to your promotions? Are you making a different type of promise in some kind of way? And I think when you have those different conversations, then you're better off. Once all that's done, I think that the best providers also go back to their brands and their customers and they tell them, okay, guys, so we planned for peak. We've actually built a plan that allows us to do 333% additional volume over the same period of time. But I'm telling you right now, if for some reason we start going over, like it's going to be, we're going to have to cap it, or we're going to have to come to some norms. I used to run promotions where we planned out like hundreds of thousands of units in a very short period of time. And those got dramatically better when we started being like, okay, here's what I'm committing to. Here's what I can do. Here's what we will do for sure, and then I'm going to do whatever I can on top of, because then everyone knew what they were going to get. Because you can't just overpromise to everybody and over-deliver on everything. Like nobody can do that level of sustainment at all. So you're better off. Personally, I think you're better off being honest and having real results than having your customers frustrated because their clients and their consumers are frustrated and everyone's calling you. And now all of a sudden it's like, I've got 6 angry accounts. They all matter to me. And I've got to start trying to pick and choose in the moment. That usually just doesn't end well for anyone.
And I think there are 2 things. First off, if you are a brand, provide a forecast, like do your best, like work with your provider to give them a roadmap for what it's going to look like. And, add the caveats that need to be added, but don't be like, oh, I'll get it to you next week. And then the next thing you know, next week is Black Friday and you never did it, because you are not setting yourself or your service provider up for success if you're not part of this. And then the other thing is like, you might need to talk to not the distribution or logistics manager. You need folks from sales and ops or marketing that are going to be driving some of these things. You might need to go deeper into your organizations than you do on the day to day. And then the last thing I would say is, if you do have somebody who participates in forecasts, how accurate are those historically? That's another question as you're doing all of the analysis that John suggested. But if you are a brand, you have to participate in the success or the failure of your providers. And if you are not participating and you expect to continue with the same SLAs, you're going to have a problem, and you're going to be at fault.
Yeah, the other thing is too, I would be trying to make sure with my with my service partners, especially if I'm a brand, I'll pay your peak surcharges, sure, but I want to also know that you've increased capacity. And if all your provider is doing is saying, oh, I've hired more people and I've brought more people on, Matt, you've been on floor, Jess, I'm sure, you go into a warehouse, there's only so many people that can legitimately be on the floor at the same time before it turns into a real problem, and it actually creates more bottlenecks than it does flow. So it's like, has your provider extended working hours? Have they added another shift? Have they added additional working days? Did they open a second building? Like, I would really be working to make sure to understand how they plan to provide additional capacity, not just taking your money and saying that they'll do more, because there has to be some way to bring up the baseline capacity. If you're going to do more delivery, if you're doing more LTL, if you're doing more truckloads, if you're warehousing more stuff, you either need more trucks, you need more space, you need more working hours. Someone that does Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, if all they think they're going to do is add 100 bodies in there, they're not going to execute well. But if now all of a sudden they take an 8, and I know everyone works more than 8 hours a day before someone in the comments jumps in there, we work 12, 16.
12 hours a day at least.
Yeah, exactly. I know that, guys. It's easy math for everyone. But if they're not saying that we're moving from 8 hours a day to 16, if they're not saying that they're moving from 5 days to 7, for all of their moves. And then the dangerous thing is sometimes when people are like, oh, well, the trucking will pick up your loads and will do whatever 7 days a week, and then you find out, but the warehouse is only working 5 or 6, meaning that there's not a balance, or vice versa. The warehouse is doing more, but the transportation movements are still using less days and things like that. So there's lots to actually make sure that you're getting the value for what you're being charged for, and you do it by making sure that there's a tangible plan in place that shows you that there's now more capacity in the system and not just more bodies on the floor at the same period of time, unless they have a massive facility and legitimately can deal with the flow.
Yeah. And I'm going to add one more thing, just in talking about the SLAs and the KPIs. It's let's have an honest conversation about what those are in peak. If you haven't negotiated multiple levels in your contracts or whatever, have a conversation about, hey, what's the expectation? What is it going to look like? You can go in there and be like, I expect everything to be the same, but that's maybe not realistic with the partners that you have. And so again, KPIs are worthless unless you have a threshold where you do something and then what it is you do. Talking about those SOPs, to whom do I speak and what questions do I ask when this goes out of tolerance, and is that the same or different during the peak season? Those are, I think, important process points to hit on.
For sure. Oh, Matt, maybe one other thing to jump into, because we talked about it the other day. The concept about what retailers maybe should or shouldn't do when it comes to looking for surge or new capacity, right? We talked about how when all of a sudden there's a crunch, everyone starts making promises. Oh, take our volume now, we'll give you X, Y, and Z, these types of things. What are your thoughts there? I would more encourage a brand, be like, don't overpromise. If you're looking for something transactional or opportunistic, be honest about it and work on that basis. Yeah, it's probably not as great of a cost conversation, but I think you're probably going to get better reception, because how many people go around making promises that providers know very, very rarely deliver the fruit that they're supposed to?
That's a great question. It's a tough question to answer, because will the honesty breed the results that you want? I don't know. Everybody's looking for a long-term solution. They don't want to be in that peak piece because they can potentially, you know, like I'll throw a name out just because you were picking on them, Walmart. You know, they come to you and be like, hey, we're going to promise you something, you know, after this is, you know, this is in the moment, I'll be more committed to do something long term if they promise me something long term now and take a hit on it, versus they came to me like, hey, I'm being opportunistic. I just need trucks right now. What can you do? I'm like, oh, this is just short term. I'm not going to be able to do anything with them after. I'm just going to get the best bang for my buck and worry only about myself. So coming from a brand's perspective, I know it's going to be a very hard conversation, to be honest. But when you find that honest service provider, I think that's where you're going to find something long lasting. If you tell them, hey, I'm going to be opportunistic at this point. If you can give me a fair price that is market and work with me, I will be able to engage in dialogue with you down the road, and you'll be in my system to be able to kind of be approachable a lot easier than I could before you were in my system.
Well, it's true. I agree with you. I think that, you know, there's an opportunity. Because if you think about it as a customer, no, but if you think about it as a customer, if every time you went to buy something randomly, right? Like let's just even something really dumb. Like let's say to go on Amazon to get some deal from a brand, you had to agree to that. Like you had to agree to essentially get their monthly subscription, or else your $5 purchase goes up to $100 purchase. Like that in itself, like nobody would respond well to. But that's really what you want to. But that's really what you want, in the sense of saying, like, look, I need transactional business right now. I don't even know what just popped up. That was very distracting.
Well,
but
that was very cool, though.
It was cool. It was cool, but I was like, what just happened there?
You can display comments. I was like,
Yeah, so I agree with Katie. It comes from being a good customer, but sometimes being a good customer it just means, hey, this is what I need right now. I get that you would love to have my business because, look, everybody wants my business. Like, I understand that, but here's what I need right now. And if you take the real opportunity to say, I hear your needs, I'm willing to meet you where you are. If you can meet me where I am for this particular market or whatever, I still think having a really smooth and professional transaction can be, to your point, something that you build on in the future. And I think, all of this, the cloak and daggers of like, well, how much volume and how long will you stick with me? It detracts from the fact that, look, sometimes people just have a certain need. And if you can leave them with a positive experience and a professional experience, to your point, it opens the door for you to go back later as someone who they knew that, hey, this person did what they said when they said it.
The problem, I to your point, John, I find and I see often is a lot of brands don't have the longevity of the person who makes that promises. So I'm dealing with John that we used to work at, call it a big dairy provider. And I've known John, we're great together. And he promises me, hey, help me out during this peak. I'm there for you. Awesome. I help him through this, rail strike. Come November, Non goes, deuces. I don't know which way to point Papa. Deuces. I'm out. I found a better job. I'm heading off to somewhere else. And then me as a service provider, I'm going, I did all this activity and all this hard work, and then now I don't have that relationship. And that's why I always say it's very important not to just have the relationship with the individual, which is very important, but also with the brand. If you're always dealing with just one person, push for a conversation with a wider audience, just to have an introduction, have a
I don't know, man.
It happens.
It does happen, but I can tell you, being on the other side there, like when I was in those roles that would make those decisions, you also have a team, right? And the team of people that are supporting that activity, they still understand like who is there, this and that. Like, I mean, I still reach out to carriers today that, when I was in different roles or whatever, help me out. You understand how they are. I think that I do agree with what you're saying in the sense that there can be some risk there, which is why I think it needs to be a fair transaction, right? Like, don't do that type of work heavily discounting and, putting your business in a different position just to do something for a favor, right? Be really professional, make sure that the stuff covers itself. So at minimum, you're covered, and your business is okay.
We got the final 2 minutes. I'll leave it to Jess because we've been bombarding.
We've been going back and forth. Yeah.
Yeah. I would just say that, I do think getting deeper into an organization is always a good thing. And a peak is a great opportunity to have some of those more collaborative conversations. But I think when you're in the middle of the fire, like, they will recognize that you have done what you said you were going to do and not over promise. And I think that's all you can do. Because again, it's survival. You didn't even have this hour, Matthew. Like,
Yeah.
and if you have a brand who's expecting you to go beyond what is appropriate in a time like this, maybe that's not a brand you want to work with long term. So like, that's something to think about. Anyway, last thoughts on Peak from anybody, or are we good to go?
Prepare as much as you can. That's my last thought. And how it all really depends. We had a lot of great advice. We talked about a lot of great things. Always reach out to Jess, John, or myself if you do have any other questions. We have a great community. One thing I got to say on the LinkedIn, I sound so old. On the LinkedIn, we have a great community. There's a lot of people willing to help and have conversations. DMs. I know a lot of shippers might be a little bit more reluctant because they don't want to be bombarded by everybody promising them the world. Some, simple DMs, confidentiality is always welcomed, and we always will kind of go through that as well. And I think reaching out to people and chatting what's happening outside of your own framework, knowing what else is going on, is very vital to your business. You might not be dealing with air, but air will impact your road. You might not be dealing with road, but the ocean bottleneck might be impacted. So talking to a good, person that's within the marketplace is fantastic. I'll start with one of us three, but obviously anybody else on LinkedIn, reach out to them.
Just reach out to us. Everybody should just reach out.
That's it. No more.
we're a great place to start.
But that's it. Nobody else can talk to you. Only us. No, John, you can take it.
Yeah, no, I echo those thoughts. I think, like I said, is try to really be honest about what you want to do. Have your plans done in advance, and know that some things are going to have to be trade-offs, right? And try to decide sooner rather than later what you're comfortable with doing and where you really want to make sure you hit home runs. If you can do it everywhere, then fantastic. I applaud your team and the prep and your partners. But for everyone else that typically has some type of struggle, try to choose your own adventure and decide how that's going to go as much as possible, and don't leave things to chance. It's great to hope and to have that kind of faith, but having a plan and being really comfortable with what you want to execute and why will always serve you well.
Yep.
Agreed. All right, guys, have a wonderful day and a good peak season, but we'll see you. We'll be on the journey with you.
Call us.